So, we are continuing in the book of James this morning, and we're nearing the end of the first chapter. But today we're talking about worthless religion, and also while we're talking about this idea of worthless religion, I also want to just kind of get a little bit of a grasp on the overall theme of this book that hopefully we've picked up on already quite a bit during this chapter. But I think there's so much in this book about being deceived, so much in this book about not understanding that all of these tests that are given, that James is giving test after test after test to know if we are truly of the faith, to know if we're truly following God, to know if we're truly seeking after God. And James has given us test after test after test. And one of the things I want us to look at is the idea that, maybe this test is about me. And maybe this is saying, do I look at my life in view of I'm just fully confident, or do I actually at least give the time to actually run these tests through myself and say, how do I fare when I actually apply these tests to myself? Because there's so much in this first portion about being deceived. And I think we were talking a little bit about this in Sunday school this morning, but I think, in this day and age, it's pretty popular for people to think they're something they're not. As I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking I probably shouldn't even bring this up, but we wouldn't have litter boxes in schools if people weren't a little bit off track on what they actually are. And so I think, and I'm not trying to be unloving towards these people or anything of the sort, but I think, a lot of us think personally that we're something that we are not. We think that we're religious. We think that we're this something. But if we actually put ourselves to a series of tests, we may find out that we're not what we think we are. We may find out that we're different, and it takes applying a little bit of testing as opposed to just being fully confident in what our heart thinks that we are. So James says here in 1:26, he says this. He says, if anyone thinks that he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, he says, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. He says, if you think you're religious, but you don't even bridle your tongue, he says, but instead you choose to be fooled by what your heart thinks you are. He says, your religion, I'm sorry, but it is worthless. It is worthless religion. And I think this is a little bit, this idea of deceiving our own heart. It's a little bit like taking a math test, okay? And you take this math test, and the teacher gives you an F, an absolute fail. And you go home feeling pretty good about it. They're like, what'd you get on the test? I got an F, but I'm feeling pretty good about it, to be honest. And you're like, wait a minute. The test went bad, yeah, but I am confident in here. And you're like, really? And I'm not saying that all tests these days are great. There's a lot of crummy, bogus tests out there, okay? A lot of things that people say, and but when it comes to the Bible, we should be like, this is what I really want to grasp a little bit today, is that take a look at the tests, okay? Take a look at the tests. Because as we're looking at these tests, a lot of people just drive on through with confidence, But I want to look a little bit today at taking a look at these tests. And, as I preach through a book, part of this all comes from the idea that we're coming to a lot of controversial portions here, guys. We really are. I'll probably say this again, but I told someone once, I'll never preach through the book of James when I first started out. Trust me, controversy is coming. My tongue got tangled. Controversy is coming in this book, okay? And people are going to say, no. Salvation is by grace through faith, and you're somehow off course. Salvation is by grace through faith, and this is true. But I don't want to be this person who stands up. James is telling us today that your religion is worthless. And I've heard it before, and I'll hear it again, that people will say, well, just your religion is worthless, but your faith is solid. And you can argue all of these things, right? You can take each test and you can say, well, this isn't exactly about your salvation. But I just want to ask you, and I want you to think for yourself, okay? I want you to think for yourself. I preach every book as if I was facing controversy. That I'm not going to stand up here and be like, believe me, trust me. When it says your religion is worthless, don't worry about it. It's just your actions are worthless. Or when I stand up here and say, believe me, it's about your faith. What I want to do is say, look at the book and let's see what we can know for sure. And what we know for absolutely for sure, is that enough to know enough about it? Maybe I'm blatering a point here, and maybe it's, but I want to look at the book, and I want to be like, you guys know, because we looked at it together, and you guys know what this is. And I would like to ask you this: what is the book of James about? What is it about? What is it talking about? Did you notice that there is nothing in here about the cross? There's nothing in here about the blood of Christ? That there's nothing in here about forgiveness? That there's nothing in here about the message of the gospel? Do you realize there's nothing? So what is the book about? He's like, the book is about those who are deceived, thinking that they already passed the test of the gospel, that they already came to Christ and confessed their sin and received forgiveness, and they're moving on in a walk of faith. And he's like, wait a minute. Let's run through a series and see what happened. And he doesn't talk about the gospel at all. He only talks about, are you deceived? Are you fooled? Did you maybe miss a step? Did you get a series of F's and you still think that you're on the right track? And this is what the book has been about, and this is what the book will be about. So as he goes through this, in the beginning it started off with the testing of your faith through trials and tribulations, right? And he says, those who endure the test will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. So right away you're like, so how does your faith stand when it hits those tests, when it hits those strains and those difficulties? Does it endure the test? And then he goes on to say, if you can't pray in faith, you're like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind, that your entire life is a shambles and it's worthless and unstable in every form. He says it's bad if you guys cannot at least be solid in this, that your faith is just weak and a mess. And then he goes on to say, towards the middle of this chapter, he's like, don't go around blaming God for your lifestyle, but actually take the time to realize that you were tempted and lured away by your own desire to do something that's wrong. Don't just say, oh, this is just how God planned me to live. And then he goes on to say that we should stop talking and start listening. Start hearing the implanted word that's able to save your soul. That instead of being in this mindset of just ready and willing to just retort and talk and speak, that we better just shut our mouths and listen and think, okay, maybe it's time to listen and hear the word that can save my soul. Maybe I should do a little less thinking for myself and a little more listening to the word of God. And then he goes on to say in verse 22, he starts talking about being doers of the word. He says, be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. He's like, don't be these people who are completely deceived. He's like, don't live your life fooled. Don't live your life fooled. You're at the party and you're all having fun, but you're really on the outside looking in the window. You're not part of it at all. You're not participating in these things. You only enjoy them and like them, but you're not doers of any of this. And you're just living a deceived life. You're fooled. You're living a life that is deceived. And then he goes into this idea of religion. How he's like, today's test is how to know if your religion is absolutely worthless. And then as we go, just a little bit of briefing into chapter 2, just so that as you look at this, you can have the right idea. So that you're like, okay, what does it mean when he says, my religion is absolutely worthless? And as we flow into chapter 2, he says this. He says, you know what? If faith doesn't pass the test, it's dead. It's dead, 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 dead. And then he goes on to say that it's useless. It's absolutely useless. He goes on to say that it does not save. He even goes on to say that it's the same faith that the demons have. Where do you think they're going to end up? They believe in God just like you do. They're not participants in it, but they have all the faith in the world in it. And he says, that's the faith that you have. Where do you think it's going to get you? And then he says, do you need to be shown, O foolish person, that faith apart from works is absolutely useless? Useless. He says, if you're failing every test that lays out for you, what do you think is the end result? And so as we look at this, as opposed to, and I know, at least online. I know there's people who will face opposition as we go through this, and they'll say, wait a minute, why are you saying salvation is based on works? I'm not saying salvation is based on works. I'm saying that you can be deceived on whether or not you have saving faith. You can be deceived on whether or not you have any walk with the Lord at all. You can be fooled on the entire thing. You can be looking at the tests and just saying, well, whatever, over and over and over, and you never see it's you that needs to apply these tests. And instead you have confidence in your own heart as opposed to applying the tests that the Bible gave. You just have this confidence without applying the tests, and you just ignore every test that you fail. And if you're failing test after test after test, eventually you need a win. You say, how would I look at the test and apply the test and give myself a score from the Bible and say, maybe this is not what saved me, but maybe I don't have faith. Maybe I don't have a walk with the Lord or a relationship with the Lord. And just one more thing about this whole idea of being deceived before we moved on. Before we argue about whether or not worthless religion means you're not saved, think of one of my favorite verses that I've been quoting a lot lately, and this is in 2 Corinthians 13:5. It says, examine yourself to see as whether you be of the faith. Test yourselves. So what are you looking for? You're looking at yourself, you're testing yourself, you're examining yourself to see if you're actually of the faith. What are you looking for? I would say anything. Absolutely anything. Anything, right? I mean, is there anything that we would throw out? I would say there's nothing. When we're examining ourselves and James says, your religion is worthless garbage, we would say, well, that's a bad thing, right? We can examine ourselves, and we don't need to split hairs and argue, because all I've heard, generally, when I've heard the book of James preached, and maybe I just heard it preached from the people, I don't know, different view, but they always say, don't worry about it. It's just religion. Don't worry about that. That's just an aspect of life. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Have confidence. And I say, well, if you're testing to see if you're of the faith and examining yourself, maybe you should apply the test to yourself and say, maybe I'm not of the faith. That's my opinion on it. And I'm not saying that this idea of worthless religion is not just an idea of worthless religion, but I'm saying it all applies to whether or not you're of the faith. Because if the end result is your faith is worthless, that's when you're in big trouble. So let's get to the point here today. Sometimes I get all this stuff in my head, and I'm worrying about oppositional thinking to my preaching and things like this, and I'm like, let's just take a look at the context of the whole book so that everybody agrees with that. We're just looking at a lot of things that are not necessarily salvational, but they're all tests that show us whether or not we're legitimate, so we should be applying them and making sure that I'm trying not to have any bias, but just looking at the exact book and what it actually says. So James says this, he says, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. So if you're thinking, oh, I'm this religious person, and what a test this is, oh my goodness, this is a big test, okay? And, and once again, I'm not saying that people are perfect, okay? I've been telling you for several weeks about the world's greatest dog, right? Our Lucy, the world's greatest dog. And, this, like a week ago, she got a hold of a pair of my wife's best pants. And she actually had to go buy new pants because this was her last good pair of pants, and she just shredded them. They were unusable. And then, like 2 days later, I let her in, and I mean, it was just for a couple of minutes, and I knew she was, this close. She was, and Lucy ran in the house, and I was watching her, and she ran up the stairs, and I was like, kids, go get her and bring her down. I don't know. And so in the whole house, there's one thing that my wife worries about, and it's this big wool rug in our bedroom, okay? And she's always particular about it because most of the carpet we've already removed, and this is just a prize rug. Albeit, if I didn't hear my wife's voice come down the stairs, she ran up there and peed on that rug just like that. And I was like, it's like she's got it in for my wife or something. But if the world's best dog slips up now and then, so can we, right? But that being said, let's not throw out these tests because we all sin. We all make mistakes. We all do things that are wrong. We do. We will, and we always will. But let's not say that James is not giving us a series of tests to test the heart, to test the quality of who we are, to see if we're actually just living a life. Living a life that is a fake, is an absolute disaster and a sham. Because messing up sometimes that we try not to, but we do, is a lot different than just going through life failing life's tests. So as we look at this, he says, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, he says this person's religion is worthless. And this is like when you think of bridling your tongue, it means you just can't get a grip on that thing. It's like a pony, right? That's just like, boy, have I got pony stories about no bridle, but not today. But if you can't control it, like a bridle, it's like you got it by the reins. You got a hold of that thing, and you're at least gonna keep it under control, right? But if you say to yourself, oh, my tongue slips and it gets away from me a little bit. It just gets a little bit out of control on me, but that's not who I am in my heart. That's not who I am. It just gets away from me. It just kind of, it runs. I didn't mean to do it, but that's not who I am in the heart, you say, right? You say, I'm failing the test because my tongue gets away from me. I'm not necessarily able to bridle that thing, but sometimes I get a little upset and it just comes flaring out, and all of a sudden my tongue is running and I'm saying things that they may be, whether it's cursing or anger or just slander or gossip, or it's just real hard for me to keep a grip on this thing, and it's just like I just don't have control of that thing. But that's not who we say to ourselves, that's not who I am in the heart. I'm not that person. It's just a simple matter of my tongue gets best of me a lot, right? That's what we would like to tell ourselves. But James is giving this to us in a form of a serious test. And when we get to chapter 3, James is going to say a lot about the tongue. He's going to say that no one is perfect and no one perfectly controls the tongue. But he's going to say, let me tell you this, the tongue is like the rudder of a ship. It gives a good direction on where that life is headed, right? The tongue tells a huge story of who we are. And here he says that if you cannot control your tongue, that your entire inner core, that your religion, and we could argue this religion, what is it? Is it your devotion to God, or is it your actions and your behaviors? Essentially, he's saying that your religion, who you say you are, is a shamble, is worthless, like pitch it in the wastebasket if your tongue is no good. What comes out of your tongue will absolutely tell the story over anything that you think you may be. So I want to look at what Jesus says here in Matthew 12:33. Jesus says this. He says, either make the tree good and its fruit good, or make the tree bad and its fruit bad. He says that the tree is known by its fruit. He says you either make what comes out of you good and what is in you good, or make what comes out of you bad and what is in you bad. He says we're not going to split these two things up. Like whatever you're saying is what you are. He says we're not dividing these two. And he goes on to say, he says, you brood of vipers. He says, how can you speak good when you are evil? He says, because out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. He says, you can't divide these two things. He says, whatever's down inside, it's going to come boiling out. And you may say to yourself, well, there are people who can say things that are not what they are, and you may be able to lie. You may be able to say, oh, I love you, baby, and then go around and be an absolute sham. Sure, you could say something, but ultimately Jesus says this. He says, listen, you guys, you cannot speak opposite of what's down inside there. Eventually, it's going to boil out of you. Eventually, what comes up is going to roll off your tongue, and it will be who you are. Eventually, especially when you're squeezed with difficulty or things, and it just comes out of you, you're going to see real clearly who you actually are. And he says this. He says, for the good person brings out of his good treasure, he says, good things. But the evil person brings out of his evil treasure evil things. And he says, listen, what is inside of you? What is really in your core, what you have gathered that you value. He says it's going to come up that stairs and off that tongue. A little pressure is applied, and all of a sudden you're about you, and you're about me, and you're about self, and it just comes raging right off of that tongue. But if you were somehow the opposite, let's say you had the fruit of the Spirit, the evidence of salvation, wouldn't you see goodness and kindness and gentleness, faithfulness and self-control? Wouldn't you see roll off of that tongue something absolutely different? If that was what was inside, absolutely you would. If what is inside is that, that's what you're going to see come off of that tongue. But if what is inside is the works of the flesh, that you say, oh, I'm not greedy and covetousness, and I'm not angry and hateful, I'm not all of those things, but a little bit of pressure is applied and it all comes off the tongue, and you say, I still deny the test. I deny the test, and I believe my heart. But the tongue tells a different story. And Jesus says, absolutely not. Absolutely not. The tongue tells the real story. It tells the real story. And then he says this, I tell you, on Judgment Day, you will give an account for every careless word you ever spoke. And then he goes on to say, for by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. And I think, this is interesting because once again, I'm not saying that on Judgment Day Jesus won't say, well, let's take a look at what came off of your tongue during your life, because he says he will. However, I don't necessarily think he needs to go about it this way, because he knows everything. He sees the heart. He sees right through us. He doesn't need to be like, let's rewind your entire life and see what came off the end of that tongue. He doesn't need to do that because he knows, right? But leastwise, he's capable of doing that, right? Leastwise, he is capable of saying, what was that right there? What? You're telling me that that's not who you are, but why did it come off your tongue? Is that not coming up from the heart? Is that not what's inside of you? Because it came out of your mouth, right? He's capable of doing that. He is capable of saying, listen, the words that came out of your mouth came right up out of your heart. And that is who you are on the inside. And you refuse to, we just like, no. But what if we came and we stood before the Lord and he said this? He said, listen, as opposed to judging you based on what you say you are or what you think you are, let's just go ahead and rewind the tape and see what's come off of that mouth. And let's judge you based on that. All of a sudden you'd be like, whoa, what do you mean? What do you mean? And listen, Jesus says this. He says in Matthew 15:17, he says, do you not see that whatever enters into the mouth passes through the stomach and is expelled? But he says, whatever comes out of the mouth, he says, comes from the heart, and this defiles a person. He says, whatever comes off of that mouth is like a biopsy. It shows you what was in there. It's like you just stuck like a, I don't know, they have like these biopsy things, like a core sample, right? And he just took a chunk out of that heart, and he's like, it's rotten. It's rotten. It's no good. And you're like, no, that was just something that slipped off the end of my tongue. No, the heart is good. The heart is good. He says, no. When he says what comes off of that tongue defiles you, it's not just because what you said was hateful or vicious or angry or unkind or something of the nature or cursing or something like that. It's because it came from your heart. It was who you are because that's where it generated from. That's where it generated from. He says it's an undeniable truth that is what is inside of you if it's able to work its way up off of your tongue. So as we're closing today, James says this: if anyone thinks that he is religious and is unable to bridle his tongue, he deceives his heart, and his religion is worthless. Worthless. He's chosen to look at the test, be like, well, that's an F, but I believe my heart. I believe in what I want to believe, and I chuck that test to the side, and I say I refuse to believe that what comes out of my mouth is really in my heart. I believe above and beyond the test that God has given to me. And I think that that's a dangerous place that we find ourselves here. So in closing today, I hope that maybe maybe I've been able to somehow, I feel like it was really messy, but I hope that somehow I was able to give you a little bit of insight of how I'm looking at this book and how I'm saying, listen, religion doesn't necessarily mean heaven or hell. But when you look at the entire book as a whole and you say, James is not talking about salvation, James is talking about seeing if you're a fake. An absolute fake on an absolute everything level. And then he goes into salvation and he says, if you're failing all the tests, then you're failing the salvation test as well. He says, it's just examine yourself, take a look at yourself. So as we look at these things, I don't want to argue about, could we split hairs on some of them? Sure we could. Sure we could. But all of them, it's just bad. It's just bad. If you're a fake, that's just bad. I don't think we need to argue that much about it. If your life, if the tests are coming out F, 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 fail, 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 you need to be like, uh-oh, right? That's how I think we should look at it. I think that's a safe view to look at this. Even though, I'll say it again, salvation is by grace through faith, is a gift of God, not of our own works, that no one can boast. It's not by what you did good, but when he puts within you the fruit of the Spirit, and when you humble yourself before God, and when you come to him seeking to be in a relationship with him, these things are going to show in your life. These are definite tests that can be shown. And James is giving us 101 ways. I've said it over and over. James is giving us 101 ways to see if we're a fake. And let's not just keep launching those tests out the window, whether or not we failed or passed. Let's not just keep ignoring what the results are. Let's take an actual look at ourselves and be like, whoa, I guess I should live by these tests. And today's test was the tongue. If the tongue is not harnessed, if you can't get a grip on it, don't tell yourself that what's inside is good when what's coming off the tongue is not. Don't deceive your own self and lie to yourself and say, I believe that I can't control my tongue, but I'm telling you that the treasure within me is still good. Be like, everything that comes off the tongue, that tells me that within me is the fruit of the flesh, covetousness, slander, quarreling, all of these things of this nature. That's what's coming off your tongue. Then you should be like, that's a fail. That's an absolute fail. So just be thinking about what comes off your tongue, and don't try to lie to your own heart about what is actually in there. If how you speak doesn't match what you think that you are. So let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer this morning. Our God and Father, I just pray that you just help us to see your word just how you want us to see it. Help it to hit our hearts the way that you want it to come to us, even though there may be some things that are a little bit more difficult. There may be variations of testing. But Lord, I just pray that you just help us to find ourselves to be genuine before you, that you would just help us to hear your word and help us not to be hard-headed, but to be open in our ears and our hearing and our thinking. And I just pray that you would just help us to learn and grow, help us to with meekness receive the word of God and let it work in our lives as opposed to fighting it, Lord. Let your spirit change us and change who we are and work within us and make us to be what you actually want us to be. And I just pray that you would do that for each of us, Lord. And I just pray this in your Son's name. Amen.